The spring of 1878 came to the Kansas plains like a promise nobody kept, and Caroline Harper stood at the edge of a field gone gray with dust, holding her late husband's gun belt in hands that had not stopped shaking since the funeral. She was 26 years old and a widow, and the wind that came down off the flat horizon carried nothing with it but the smell of dry earth and the faint, bitter tang of wood smoke from a stove she could barely afford to feed. Thomas Harper had been dead 11 weeks. A fever had taken him in the dead of January, the kind of sickness that swept through a man in 3 days and left nothing behind but silence in a house built for 2 voices. Caroline had buried him herself, with the help of her neighbor Mrs. Odell and the circuit preacher who rode through Sweetwater Flats twice a month, and she had told herself that she would not fall apart, because falling apart did not plant corn and it did not feed the mule, and it certainly did not pay the note that Elias Pruitt at the Sweetwater Flats Bank had come calling about not once, not twice, but 3 times since the ground had thawed. She looked down at the gun belt in her hands. 2 Colt revolvers, well-oiled despite the months of neglect, and a Henry rifle that Thomas had carried through the last years of the war and had loved more than he ever let on. He used to say a man's guns were the last thing he owned that no one could take from him. Caroline supposed he had been wrong about that, because she was fixing to sell them, and there was nothing in the wide gray Kansas sky that was going to stop her. She had thought about it for 3 nights running, lying awake in the bed that still smelled faintly of him, staring at the ceiling and doing arithmetic in her head that never came out right. The seed corn she needed would cost $11 if she bought it from the co-op in town, more if she had to buy it from Pruitt's store, which held a near monopoly on such things since the co-op had gone under the winter before. She had $4.60 to her name, a mule that was more stubborn than useful, and 40 acres of land that would go back to the bank by autumn if she did not get something growing in it soon. The guns were the only thing of value she had left. She wrapped them in a piece of old blanket, saddled the mule, and rode the 6 miles into Sweetwater Flats with her jaw set and her eyes dry, because she had promised herself in the dark of that January night, kneeling by Thomas's grave with the frost still not gone from the ground, that she would not let this land beat her. She did not know yet that riding into town that morning would change the whole shape of her life, but there was a small, unfamiliar flutter of something like hope in her chest as the mule's hooves beat a slow rhythm against the hard-packed road, and she chose, for reasons she could not entirely explain, to let herself feel it. Sweetwater Flats was not much of a town, not by the standards of Wichita or Dodge City, but it had a general store, a livery, a bank, a church with a steeple that leaned a little to the east, and a gunsmith shop with a hand-painted sign that read Barnett Guns and Goods, ESD. 1874. It was to this shop that Mrs. Odell had told her to go, because the man who owned it, a fellow named Frank Barnett, had a reputation in the county for paying an honest price, and for not taking advantage of a body who did not know the value of what they carried. He fought in the war, same as your Thomas, Mrs. Odell had said, sitting in Caroline's kitchen the week before with a cup of chicory coffee going cold in her hands. Cavalry scout, they say, out west after that, chasing renegades and outlaws for the army before he settled here. Never married, keeps to himself mostly, but he is fair, Caroline. Fairer than most men you will find in this county, and certainly fairer than Elias Pruitt, who would skin his own mother for a nickel. Caroline had not known what to make of that description then. She still did not entirely, as she tied her mule to the post outside the shop and stood for a moment gathering her courage, the wrapped guns heavy and awkward in her arms. The bell above the door rang thin and bright when she pushed it open, and the smell that greeted her was gun oil and leather and cedar shavings, a smell that reminded her so sharply of Thomas cleaning his revolvers at the kitchen table on Sunday evenings that she had to stop just inside the doorway and steady herself against the frame. "Help you, ma'am." The voice came from behind the counter, low and even, and when Caroline looked up, she saw a man perhaps 6 or 7 years older than herself, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going the faintest bit gray at the temples and a face that had clearly spent a great many years squinting into western sun. He wore no hat inside his own shop, and his sleeves were rolled to the elbow, and there was a smear of gun black across one forearm that he had not bothered to wipe away. His eyes were a warm brown, and they held a kind of careful patience that Caroline had not expected from a man who dealt in weapons for a living. "I have some things to sell," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Guns. They belong to my husband." Something shifted in the man's face, not pity exactly, but a recognition, and he came around the counter with an unhurried grace and reached to help her set the bundle down. "Frank Barnett," he said, "and I am sorry for your loss, ma'am, whoever it was." "Caroline Harper," she said. "My husband was Thomas Harper. We have the homestead out past the Odell place along Cottonwood Creek." "I knew him a little," Frank said, and there was something gentle in the way he said it, as though he understood that this fact might matter to her, might be a small comfort in a room full of strangers' merchandise. "Bought powder from him once or twice when he came through town. Good man from what I saw of him. I heard he passed this winter. I am sorry, truly." Caroline nodded, because there was nothing else to do, and unwrapped the blanket with hands that had gone unsteady again despite her best efforts. Frank looked at the guns for a long moment without touching them, and Caroline had the strange sense that he was giving her time, that he understood this was not simply a transaction to her but something closer to a small burial, a second parting from a man she had loved. Then he picked up the Henry rifle first, turning it over in his hands with the careful attention of a man who knew exactly what he was looking at, checking the action, running a thumb along the stock. "This is a fine rifle," he said. "Well kept, he must have cared for it. He cleaned it every Sunday," Caroline said, "rain or no rain." Frank set it down gently and picked up one of the Colts, checking the cylinder, the balance of it in his palm. "These are good pieces, too. I could get you a fair price on all three, Mrs. Harper. I want you to know that before we go any further, so you are not wondering if I am taking advantage of your situation." "I would appreciate that," Caroline said, and found herself surprised by how much she meant it. He named a figure that made her breath catch, more than double what she had dared hope for, enough not only for seed corn but for a bit of salt pork and flour and perhaps even new boots for the coming winter. And when she opened her mouth to say that surely he was mistaken, that the guns could not be worth so much, he held up a hand. "I know what the market pays for used firearms in this county, Mrs. Harper, and I know these are worth what I am offering. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise just because you are a woman standing alone in my shop." He paused, and something in his face softened further. "May I ask what you need the money for?" "Only so I understand what I am helping with, if you do not mind my asking." Caroline felt her chin lift, some old pride asserting itself even through the exhaustion. "Seed corn," she said, "and enough left over to keep the note current with the bank if I am careful. Elia's Prout has been by the house twice already this spring, reminding me the payment is due." Frank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly at the mention of Prout's name, and Caroline wondered, not for the first time, what history existed between the two men. "Prout is a hard man to owe money to," he said carefully. "I would advise you to get to the co-op quick as you can, before the seed runs low. Folks have been buying heavy this spring on account of the drought last year making everyone nervous." "That is exactly where I am headed," Caroline said, "the moment we finish here." He counted out the money from a strongbox beneath the counter, and as he pressed the bills into her palm his hand lingered a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and Caroline felt a warmth climb up through her chest that had nothing to do with the money at all. She told herself it was merely gratitude. She was not entirely sure she believed it. "Thank you, Mr. Barnett," she said. "You do not know what this means." "I have some notion," he said quietly. "I lost my own wife some years back, before I ever came out this way. I know what it is to be left holding a life that used to belong to two people and now belongs to one." He said it plainly, without self-pity, the way a man speaks of an old wound that has healed crooked but healed nonetheless, and Caroline found herself looking at him with new eyes, seeing not simply a gunsmith with fair prices, but a man who had walked a road not unlike her own. "I am sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago," Frank said. "Fever, same as your Thomas, I would wager, though it was cholera that took Susanna out in Missouri before the war even started proper. I have had a good many years to make my peace with it." He looked at her a moment, and something passed between them that neither of them named. "You take care getting that seed home, Mrs. Harper, and if you find yourself needing anything else, my door is open." Caroline rode away from Sweetwater Flats that afternoon with a sack of good seed corn balanced across the mule's back, $4.60 grown into something that felt, for the first time in months, like the beginning of a future instead of merely the tail end of a grief, and a small, warm ember of curiosity about a gunsmith with kind eyes that she could not quite manage to snuff out no matter how she tried. She did not look back once at the town growing small behind her. She had made her decision to sell the guns, and now she meant to plant and to grow and to survive, and if some part of her heart had been quietly, cautiously stirred awake in the process, she supposed there was no crime in that. The planting that spring was harder than Caroline had imagined it could be, even after a winter of hard imagining. She had watched Thomas work the fields for the 3 years of their marriage, had brought him water and cornbread at midday, and thought she understood the shape of the labor. But understanding a thing from the shade of a porch was not the same as doing it herself, alone, with a mule who seemed to have opinions about every furrow she tried to plow. She rose before dawn each morning and worked until the light failed, her hands blistering and then callousing over, her back aching in ways she had never known a back could ache, and there were nights she wept from sheer exhaustion before she managed to fall asleep, and mornings she woke and, for one terrible moment, reached across the bed for a husband who was no longer there. But the seed went into the ground, row after careful row, and by the 3rd week of April the first green shoots had begun to show themselves against the dark-turned earth, and Caroline stood at the edge of her field one evening with the sunset going gold and rose behind the distant line of cottonwoods along the creek, and felt something in her chest ease for the first time since the funeral. It was around this time that Frank Barnett began, quite without announcing his intentions to himself or to anyone else, to find reasons to ride out along Cottonwood Creek. The first time, he told himself it was because he had heard from the co-op manager that Mrs. Harper's mule had come up lame, and a man in his position, a man who sold and traded and occasionally repaired the tools that farmers needed, could hardly be blamed for riding out to see if there was anything he might do to help. He brought with him a poultice his old scout partner had taught him for treating a strained leg, and he found Caroline in the barn, kneeling beside the mule with her sleeves rolled up in dirt on her cheek, looking so thoroughly overwhelmed and so thoroughly determined not to show it that something in Frank's chest turned over entirely. "Mrs. Harper," he said from the doorway, and she startled and turned, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "Mr. Barnett," she said finally, "this is unexpected. I heard your mule came up lame," he said, holding up the poultice as evidence of his good intentions. "Thought you might could use a hand if you would not mind the company." Caroline looked at him for a long moment, and Frank had the distinct sense that she was deciding something, weighing his offer against some private calculation of pride and need, and he found himself hoping, with an intensity that surprised him, that need would win out. "I would not mind the company," she said finally. "I would not mind it at all." He spent 2 hours in that barn treating the mule's leg and talking with her about nothing of consequence: the weather, the price of feed, a story about a jackrabbit that had gotten into her kitchen the week before, and led her on a chase around the table that had ended with her laughing despite herself for the first time in months. Frank found himself laughing too, a real laugh, the kind he had not managed in longer than he cared to admit, and when he finally rode back toward town in the blue dusk, He caught himself smiling at nothing at all, smiling simply because the world seemed, for a few hours that afternoon, to have grown a little less lonely. He came back the following week with a new hinge for her barn door, which had been hanging crooked since before Thomas had died, and the week after that with a length of good rope she had mentioned needing. And by the time the corn stood knee-high in the fields, no one in Sweetwater Flats was particularly surprised to see Frank Barnett's horse tied up outside the Harper place 2 or 3 evenings a week, though plenty of tongues wagged about it at the church social and outside the general store. Caroline heard the whispers eventually, carried to her by Mrs. Odell with a mixture of concern and barely disguised delight. "They are saying you and the gunsmith have gotten friendly," Mrs. Odell said one afternoon, settling into the chair at Caroline's kitchen table with the particular satisfaction of a woman delivering gossip she considers thoroughly justified. Mrs. Pruitt herself mentioned it after church, though I do not know why that woman feels entitled to an opinion on anybody's business but her own. Caroline felt her face heat and busied herself with the coffee pot rather than answer immediately. "He has been kind to me," she said finally. "That is all it is, Mrs. Odell. He fixes my hinges and my mule's leg, and he does not ask for anything in return," said Mrs. Odell, in a tone that suggested she believed considerably more than she was willing to say outright. "Well, I will tell you this much, Caroline. Thomas Harper was a fine man, and I loved him like a nephew, God rest him, but he has been gone 4 months now, and there is no shame in a woman finding a little warmth in a cold world, provided she goes about it decent. And Frank Barnett is about as decent a man as this county has ever produced. You could do a great deal worse than to let yourself be friendly with him." Caroline did not answer that directly, but she thought about it a great deal in the days that followed, turning the idea over in her mind the way she might turn over a stone to see what lay beneath it. She thought about the warmth that rose in her chest each time she heard Frank's horse coming up the road. She thought about the ease of talking with him, the way he listened to her the way Thomas rarely had, not out of unkindness on Thomas's part, but simply because Thomas had been a quiet man, a man who showed love through labor and provision rather than conversation, and she had loved him for it. But she had also, if she was honest with herself, sometimes been lonely inside her own marriage in a way she had never quite named until now, sitting across a kitchen table from a man who asked her questions and waited, genuinely waited, to hear her answers. She thought too about guilt, about whether it was a betrayal of Thomas's memory to feel anything at all for another man so soon, and she brought this worry, eventually, to the circuit preacher when he came through town in early June. "Grief is not a debt you pay off and then you are free," the preacher told her, an older man with kind eyes and a voice roughened by years of preaching in dusty churches across 3 counties. "Grief is a companion that walks beside you, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but it does not require you to be alone forever to prove you loved someone true. Thomas Harper would not want you to spend the rest of your days in an empty house out of some notion of loyalty to his memory. A good man wants happiness for the ones he loved, even happiness he is not there to see." Caroline held those words close in the weeks that followed, and slowly, cautiously, she allowed herself to stop fighting the warmth that rose in her whenever Frank Barnett's horse came up the road. The drought scare came in July, as it so often did on the Kansas plains, a stretch of 3 weeks without rain that turned the sky a hard, merciless blue, and had every farmer in the county watching their corn with the particular anxious attention of a mother watching a sick child. Caroline's crop, planted a little later than most because of the delay in selling the guns, was more vulnerable than her neighbors, the stalks not yet deep-rooted enough to weather a prolonged dry spell, and she watched the leaves begin to curl and yellow at the edges with a rising panic that she could not entirely suppress. Frank came out 3 evenings running to help her haul water from the creek, filling barrels and hauling them by wagon to douse the rows nearest the house, a labor that could not save the whole field but might, if they were fortunate, Save enough of it to matter." They worked side by side in the fading light, saying little, both of them too tired and too worried to make conversation. And on the third evening, as they stood resting a moment beside the wagon with the last barrel emptied and the stars beginning to prick out overhead, Caroline turned to him and said the thing she had been holding back for weeks. "I do not know how to thank you for all you have done, Frank," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name aloud, and she saw him notice it, saw something flicker across his face in the dim light. "You have no obligation to me. You barely knew Thomas, and yet here you are, hauling water until your arms shake, same as mine." Frank was quiet a moment, looking out over the darkening field rather than at her. "I do not do it out of obligation, Caroline," he said, and his voice was low and careful, the voice of a man choosing his words with great deliberation. "I do it because I want to see this farm succeed. I do it because I want to see you succeed. And I would be lying to you, and to myself, if I did not admit that I have come to care for you a great deal these past months, more than a man ought to care for a widow he has known so short a time. And if that is unwelcome to you, you have only to say so, and I will keep my distance and my respect for you both." Caroline's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it in the quiet dusk. "It is not unwelcome," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she intended, but steady. "I have thought about you a great deal too, Frank Barnett, more than I know what to do with, if I am honest." He turned to look at her then, and in the last blue light of the evening, with the smell of wet earth and cottonwood rising around them and the tiredness of shared labor still heavy in their limbs, he reached out and took her hand gently, as though asking a question with the gesture rather than making a claim, and Caroline let him, and did not pull away. "I will not rush you," Frank said. "I know you are still finding your feet after losing Thomas, and I will not push you toward anything you are not ready for. But I wanted you to know how matters stand with me, so there is no confusion between us." "Thank you," Caroline said, "for being honest, and for not rushing me. I think I would like to see where this goes, Frank, slowly, if that suits you." "It suits me fine," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice that made her chest ache in the good way, the way that felt like healing rather than hurt. "Slowly suits me just fine, Caroline." They stood there a while longer in the dark, hand in hand beside the empty water barrels, and though neither of them said anything more of consequence, something had shifted between them that evening, some quiet threshold crossed, and when Frank finally rode back toward town well past dark, Caroline stood on her porch and watched him go until the sound of his horse's hooves had long since faded into the vast Kansas night. And she found herself smiling in a way she had not smiled since before Thomas took ill. The rain came 4 days later, a hard, blessed thunderstorm that broke the drought and left the corn standing a little greener, a little stronger, than it had any right to after such a dry spell, and Caroline stood in her doorway watching it fall and thought, with a certainty that surprised her by how little fear it carried, that perhaps her life was not over after all, merely changed, and that change, she was beginning to understand, was not always the enemy she had assumed it to be. It was not long after the rains broke the drought that Elias Prout came calling again, and this time he did not come alone. Caroline heard the wagon before she saw it, the particular creak and rattle that she had come to associate with trouble over the past months, and when she stepped out onto her porch, wiping flour from her hands onto her apron, she saw Prout himself sitting stiff and self-important on the wagon bench, and beside him, a man she did not recognize, thin and sharp-featured, with a way of looking at her land that made her skin crawl even from a distance. "Mrs. Harper," Prout said, climbing down from the wagon with the exaggerated care of a man who considered his own dignity a precious commodity. He was perhaps 50, gone soft and thick around the middle from a life spent behind a bank counter rather than behind a plow, with mutton-chop whiskers he was clearly proud of and small, calculating eyes. "I trust you are keeping well." "Well enough, Mr. Prout," Caroline said, staying on the porch rather than coming down to meet him, a small assertion of the only power she felt she possessed. "What brings you out this way?" "Business, Mrs. Harper, business." He gestured to the man beside him. "This is Mr. Whitlock, from the Railroad Survey Office in Topeka. They are looking at land along the creek here for a spur line, and I have been asked to make inquiries as to what parcels might be available for purchase." Caroline felt something cold settle in her stomach. "This land is not for sale." Now, Prout said, in the tone of a man humoring a child. "I understand you have grown attached to the place, and that is natural enough, a woman's sentiment being what it is. But you must consider your situation practically. You are alone out here, Mrs. Harper, with a note still owing on this land, and Mr. Whitlock's office is prepared to offer a very generous sum, considerably more than the land would fetch on the open market otherwise." "I said it is not for sale," Caroline repeated, and this time her voice carried an edge that made even Prout pause. "My husband broke this ground with his own hands, Mr. Prout. I have a crop in that field that will bring in enough this fall to clear the note entirely, and I intend to see it through. You may tell Mr. Whitlock that Sweetwater Flats has other land to survey." Prout's smile thinned considerably, though he kept it fixed in place. "I do hope you know what you are doing, Mrs. Harper. Corn prices are not what they once were, and a single bad frost, a single hailstorm, could undo an entire season's labor. I would hate to see you lose this land to the bank when you might have gotten a fair price for it while the offer stood." "I will take my chances with the frost and the hail, Mr. Prout, thank you kindly," Caroline said. "Good day to you both." She watched them go with her heart hammering, and it was only after the wagon had disappeared down the road that she allowed herself to sit heavily on the porch steps and let the fear she had been holding back finally show itself on her face. The note. She had been so consumed with the crop, with the drought, with the slow unfolding warmth of whatever was growing between herself and Frank, that she had allowed herself to forget, for whole stretches of days at a time, that the bank still held paper on this land, and that paper did not care one bit about hope or love or the color of the corn in July. She told Frank about the visit that same evening, when he rode out with a jar of honey from a hive he kept behind his shop, a gift he had taken to bringing with increasing regularity, and she watched his expression darken as she recounted the conversation. "Railroad speculation," Frank said when she had finished. "That explains a great deal. There has been talk for a year now of a spur line coming through this part of the county, and Prout has been buying up notes on land near the creek quiet as he can manage, hoping to sell it at a profit once the survey is confirmed. I did not think he would come after your place specifically, given the note is with his own bank, but I should have known better. The man cannot see a dollar without wanting to hold it." "He as much as told me my crop could fail," Caroline said, and she heard the tremor in her own voice and hated it. "And he is not wrong, Frank. One bad storm and I lose everything, and then what? I have no family left in this county. Thomas's people are all back in Ohio, and mine are further still. If I lose this land, I do not know what becomes of me." Frank reached across the porch step and took her hand, the gesture as natural now as breathing, and Caroline let him, grateful beyond words for the solid warmth of it. "You will not lose this land," he said, with a quiet certainty that steadied her more than any argument could have. "I promise you that, Caroline. If it comes to it, I have savings enough to help cover the note myself, and I would not think twice about it." "I could not ask that of you," Caroline said, though the offer moved her more than she could easily express. "You have already given me so much, Frank. The money for the guns, the seed, all the hours of labor you have put into this farm that is not even yours." "You did not ask," Frank said simply. "I am offering. There is a difference, Caroline, and I would ask you to let me have the dignity of giving where I choose to give, the same as you had the dignity of selling what you chose to sell, back in the spring." He paused, and something more tender crept into his voice. "Besides, I have come to think of this place as something closer to mine than I perhaps ought to admit yet. I would not see it lost to a man like Prout for all the money in his bank." Caroline felt tears prick at her eyes, unexpected and entirely unstoppable, and she did not try very hard to hide them. "You are a good man, Frank Barnett," she said. "A far better man than I think you know." "I have had a good teacher these past months," Frank said, and when she looked at him questioningly, he added, "You, Caroline, watching you fight for this place, fight for a life you were not sure you still wanted after losing Thomas. It has taught me things about courage I thought I already understood from my years scouting and soldiering, but I understand them better now, watching you plant corn with blistered hands and refuse to give up." They sat together on the porch steps as the evening deepened around them, and though the shadow of Pruett's visit had not entirely lifted, Caroline found that it weighed less heavily with Frank's hand in hers, and that was, she was coming to understand, precisely the gift he had been offering her all along, not simply help with the labor of the farm, but the assurance that she no longer had to carry the weight of her fears entirely alone. The corn grew tall and green through the rest of that summer, and Caroline's fear of drought gave way, gradually, to a cautious hope, and then, by August, to something almost like confidence. The rains came steady enough to keep the ground soft, and the stalks rose higher than she had dared hope, heavy with the promise of a good harvest, and she began, for the first time since Thomas's death, to allow herself to imagine a future that stretched further than the next week's worries. It was in August, too, that Frank finally asked her to the harvest social, an annual gathering held in the church hall and the field beside it, where the whole county came together to celebrate the end of the growing season with music and food and dancing that went on late into the night. And though the actual harvest was still weeks away, the social itself was held in anticipation, a chance for the community to gather before the hardest labor of the year began in earnest. "I would be honored to have you as my companion for the evening," Frank said, standing in her kitchen with his hat in his hands, looking oddly nervous for a man who had faced down outlaws and Comanche raiders in his years scouting for the army. "If you think it proper, that is. I know Thomas has not been gone a full year yet, and I would not want to bring gossip down on you if you are not ready for that." Caroline considered the question seriously, because it deserved serious consideration, and found, when she searched her own heart, that the answer came easily. "I think Thomas would want me to go on living, Frank," she said, "and I think I would like very much to attend the social with you. Let the gossips say what they will. I have grown tired of arranging my life around other people's opinions." The evening of the social was warm and clear, the kind of late summer evening that seemed to hold the whole sky in shades of amber and violet, and Caroline wore the one good dress she owned, a soft blue calico that Thomas had bought her the Christmas before he died, and felt, as she climbed up onto the seat of Frank's wagon, a lightness in her chest that had been entirely absent from her life for the better part of a year. The church hall was strung with lanterns, and a trio of local men played fiddle and guitar and a battered old accordion, and the tables along the wall groaned under the weight of every family's best cooking, and Caroline found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, simply enjoying herself, laughing at Mrs. Odell's stories, admiring the Pruitt daughter's new dress with genuine warmth despite her feelings about the girl's father, and dancing. When Frank finally worked up the courage to ask her, in the flickering lantern light with a grace she had not known she still possessed, "You dance well, Mr. Barnett," she said, teasing him gently as they turned together to the music. "I had a good many years to practice at Fort Riley dances before I mustered out," Frank said, "though I will confess I have not had much occasion to use the skill since. There has not been much reason to dance, these past years until now." "And what has changed that, exactly?" Caroline asked, though she already knew the answer and simply wanted the pleasure of hearing him say it. "You know precisely what has changed, Caroline Harper," Frank said, and there was something in his eyes in that moment, warm and open and entirely without guile, that made her breath catch. "You have changed it. You have gone and made me want things I had given up wanting, and I am not entirely sure what to do with myself, except to keep showing up at your farm with excuses to see you, and hope that eventually you will tell me plainly whether that is what you want too." Caroline stopped dancing, right there in the middle of the church hall floor, though the fiddle kept playing and the other couples kept turning around them, and she looked up at Frank with a clarity that surprised her with its own steadiness. "I want that, Frank," she said. "I have wanted it for weeks now, if I am honest with myself, and I have simply been too frightened of my own grief to say so plainly. But I am saying it now. I want you to keep showing up. I want you to keep finding excuses, or better yet, I would rather you stop needing excuses at all, and simply came because you wish to see me, plain and honest, the same as I wish to see you." Frank's face broke into a smile so wide and so unguarded that it transformed him entirely, stripped away the careful reserve he had carried since she first met him in his shop, and he reached up and touched her cheek, gently, right there in front of half the county. "Then I will come plain and honest from now on," he said, "and I will tell you plain and honest, Caroline, that I have fallen in love with you, somewhere between hauling water to your corn and mending your mule's leg, and I do not intend to fall out of it any time soon, if you will let me stay." "I will let you stay," Caroline whispered, and when he leaned down and kissed her, softly, carefully, as though she were something precious he was afraid of damaging, she felt the last of her grief-bound caution dissolve into something warmer and more hopeful than she had allowed herself to feel in the whole long year since Thomas's death. The whole church hall had gone a little quiet around them, she realized dimly, and when she pulled back from the kiss she saw Mrs. Odell dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief and grinning fit to split her face. And she saw, too, the sour look on Elias Prute's face where he stood near the refreshment table, and found she did not care one bit about his displeasure. They did not have long to enjoy the simple happiness of that evening before trouble found them again, as trouble had a way of doing in a county where money and land and pride were so tightly intertwined. It came 3 weeks later, in early September, in the form of a letter delivered to Caroline's door by the boy who carried the mail out from town, a letter bearing the seal of the Sweetwater Flats Bank and containing, in Elias Prute's own cramped handwriting, a notice that the note on her land was due in full within 30 days, a full 2 months earlier than the original agreement had specified. Caroline read the letter twice through, standing in her own doorway with the September sun warm on her shoulders and a coldness spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the weather, and then she saddled the mule and rode straight for town, the letter clutched in her fist the whole way. She found Frank in his shop, cleaning a rifle for a customer who had just left, and she thrust the letter at him without a word, watching his face darken as he read it. "This is not right," he said when he finished. The original note specified November 1st. "I remember Thomas mentioning the terms to me once, back before he took ill. Prute cannot simply move the date at his own convenience." "He can if the paperwork allows for it," Caroline said, and she heard the fear cracking through her voice despite her best efforts to sound calm. "There must be some clause, some technicality. He wants this land for the railroad, Frank, and he means to have it, one way or another, and if I cannot pay by October, he will take it, and there will be nothing I can do to stop him." Frank set down the letter and took both her hands in his, steadying her with the simple solidity of his presence. "We will go to the bank together," he said. "Right now. I want to see this note with my own eyes, and I want Prute to explain to my face why he has changed the terms without proper cause." They found Prute in his office behind the bank counter, and when he saw them enter together, something flickered across his face, quickly masked, that told Caroline he had been expecting exactly this confrontation and had prepared himself for it. "Mrs. Harper, Mr. Barnett," Prute said, folding his hands atop his desk with an air of wounded patience. "I assume you have come about the notice." "We have," Frank said, his voice hard in a way Caroline had not heard from him before, the voice, she suspected, of the scout and soldier he had once been. "The original agreement specified November 1st, Prute. I want to know what gives you cause to move the date." Prute reached into his desk drawer and produced a document, sliding it across to them with an air of theatrical reluctance. "There is a clause, Mr. Barnett, buried in the fine print, permitting the bank to call the note early in the event of, and I quote, changed circumstances materially affecting the borrower's ability to repay. Mrs. Harper's husband has died. That is, I am sorry to say, a changed circumstance. He died in January, Caroline said, fury rising hot beneath her fear now. You did not call the note in January or February or any month since, and my crop is nearly ready for harvest. What has changed between then and now, except that the railroad survey has come through, and you have decided you want my land more than you want your interest payments? Pruett's composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of something calculating and unkind before the mask of wounded innocence slid back into place. I am simply exercising the bank's rights under the agreement, Mrs. Harper. I would suggest you find the funds within 30 days or make other arrangements. Frank leaned forward, both hands flat on the desk, and though his voice remained level, there was a steel in it that made even Pruitt lean back in his chair. I have known you a long time, Elias, and I have never once seen you exercise a clause like that against any other family in this county, not even the Hendersons, who were 3 months behind on their note last winter, and you let it ride without a word. You are doing this because Whitlock's railroad wants this land, and you mean to squeeze Mrs. Harper off it so you can sell it to them at a profit. I do not think a judge in Topeka would look kindly on that if it came to a formal inquiry, and I have a mind to write to one and find out. The threat, delivered so calmly, seemed to land harder than any shouting could have, and Pruitt's face went a shade paler. There is no need for threats, Mr. Barnett. I am, of course, willing to be reasonable if Mrs. Harper can demonstrate good faith toward repayment. The crop comes in at the end of October, Caroline said. It will bring more than enough to clear the note in full if you give me until November as originally agreed. Pruitt was quiet a long moment, clearly weighing the cost of pushing further against a man who had just implied he might involve the courts, and finally he gave a curt nod. Very well. November 1st, as originally specified. But I will expect payment in full, Mrs. Harper, to the penny, with no further delays. You will have it, Caroline said, and she and Frank left the bank together, walking out into the September sunshine with her heart still pounding, though this time with something closer to triumph than fear. Thank you, she said, once they were outside. I do not know that I could have stood up to him alone. You would have found a way, Frank said. You have found a way through everything else this year, but I am glad I did not have to watch you do it alone all the same. He took her hand as they walked toward where the mule and his horse waited, and Caroline found herself smiling despite the tension of the morning, because whatever came next, she understood now that she would not be facing it by herself. The harvest, when it finally came at the end of October, was better than Caroline had dared hope even in her most optimistic moments, the corn standing thick and golden across the whole 40 acres, and she and Frank worked side by side through the long autumn days, joined by Mrs. Odell's grown sons, and a handful of other neighbors, who came to help with the particular generosity that frontier communities reserved for a widow, who had proven herself willing to work as hard as any man for the land she meant to keep. They brought in wagon after wagon of corn to the grain elevator in town, and when the final tally was counted, Caroline found she had enough not only to clear the note in full, with 2 full weeks to spare before Pruitt's deadline, but enough besides to buy a second mule, to repair the roof that had been leaking since the winter Thomas died, and to set a little money aside against whatever the following year might bring. She walked into Pruitt's bank on the last day of October, laid the full sum on his desk in cash, and watched with quiet satisfaction as he counted it twice through, clearly hoping to find some deficiency he could exploit, and found none. The note is paid in full, Mrs. Harper, he said finally, sounding almost sorry to admit it. The land is yours, clear and unencumbered. Thank you, Mr. Pruitt, Caroline said, and she meant it as much as courtesy allowed, because whatever his motives, the man had in the end honored the agreement once pressed to do so, and there was a certain satisfaction in having beaten him fairly rather than through any trick of her own. I trust the railroad survey found other land to interest them. They have expressed interest in a parcel further south, Prude admitted, with poor grace. You are fortunate in that regard. I am fortunate in a great many regards, Caroline said, thinking of Frank waiting outside with the wagon, and she left the bank that day with a lightness in her step that she had not felt since long before Thomas's death, a sense that the worst of the year's trials had finally, truly passed. Winter came on gently that year, without the harsh brutality that had claimed Thomas the winter before, and Caroline found herself, for the first time in a great many months, with time enough to simply live rather than merely survive. Frank came out to the farm nearly every day now, sometimes to help with whatever small tasks the season required, sometimes simply to sit by the fire with her in the evenings and talk, and slowly, without either of them quite marking the exact moment it happened, the shape of their courtship deepened into something neither of them had any doubt was permanent. It was on a clear, cold evening in December, with the first snow of the season lying thin and bright across the fields, and the stars burning fierce and close in the way they only seemed to burn on the high plains in winter, that Frank asked her to marry him. He did it simply, without ceremony, kneeling on one knee in her own kitchen with a ring that had belonged to his mother, a small gold band with a modest garnet stone that caught the firelight when he held it up to her. "Caroline Harper," he said, and his voice shook slightly, the first time she had ever heard him sound anything less than steady. "I have loved you since the day you walked into my shop with your husband's guns wrapped in an old blanket, and I have loved you more every single day since, watching you fight for this land and this life with a courage I have rarely seen matched by any soldier I served alongside. I would be the proudest, luckiest man in the state of Kansas if you would consent to be my wife." Caroline felt tears rising, warm and unashamed, and she knelt down in front of him so that they were eye to eye and took his face in both her hands. "Frank Barnett," she said, "you have given me back a life I thought I had lost forever, and you have given it to me gently and patiently, and without ever once asking for more than I was ready to give. I love you. I want to be your wife. I want to build a life with you on this land, the same land Thomas and I built together, and I do not think there is any disrespect to his memory in saying so, because I believe truly that he would want exactly this for me." They were married in the Sweetwater Flats church the following March, on a day when the first true warmth of spring had finally broken through the last of winter's grip, with Mrs. Odell weeping happily in the front pew and half the county in attendance, and even Elias Prout, grudgingly, sent a small gift, a set of silver spoons that Caroline suspected his wife had chosen without much input from him at all. Caroline wore a new dress for the occasion, pale cream muslin that Mrs. Odell had helped her sew over the preceding weeks, and when Frank turned to see her walking down the short aisle of the church, his face held an expression of such open, unguarded joy that Caroline felt the whole weight of the past year, the grief and the fear and the backbreaking labor of rebuilding a life from nothing, lift away from her entirely, replaced by something lighter and more certain than she had ever imagined she would feel again. The preacher who had comforted her the summer before, who had told her that grief was a companion rather than a debt to be paid off, presided over the ceremony with evident pleasure, and when he pronounced them husband and wife, the whole church seemed to exhale at once, a great collective breath of happiness for two people who had each known enough loss to appreciate exactly what they had found in each other. They combined their households that spring, Frank keeping his shop in town, but spending most of his nights out at what had once been the Harper place and was now, simply, home, and Caroline found herself, in the months that followed, tending both the farm and, on days when Frank needed an extra hand, the counter of the gun shop, where she discovered she had a natural talent for talking customers through the merits of one rifle over another. Having absorbed more from Thomas's careful maintenance rituals than she had ever realized. The following spring, in 1880, Caroline gave birth to a son, whom they named Thomas Franklin Barnett, honoring both the husband she had lost and the man who had given her a second chance at love. And Frank held the boy in the crook of his arm on the porch of the farmhouse with an expression of such fierce, tender pride that Caroline, watching from the doorway, thought her heart might simply overflow with the fullness of it. 2 years after that came a daughter, Susanna Rose, named for the wife Frank had lost so many years before in Missouri. A gesture that moved Frank to tears the evening Caroline suggested it, sitting by the fire with their infant daughter sleeping against his chest. "You did not have to do that," he said, his voice rough. "You did not have to give our daughter her name." "I wanted to," Caroline said. "She gave you love once, and grief taught you how to love again when it came time to give it to me. It seemed only right that some part of her should live on in our family, the same as some part of Thomas lives on in our son." The farm prospered in the years that followed, the 40 acres growing eventually to 60, as Frank sold his gun shop, having found the life of a farmer and a father suited him better than he had ever expected, and put the proceeds into more land along the creek. The 2 Colt revolvers and the Henry rifle that Caroline had sold that desperate spring morning found their way back into the family's possession some years later, when Frank, learning by chance that the man who had bought them from his own stock years before was looking to sell, purchased them back without telling Caroline, and presented them to her on the anniversary of Thomas's death, not as weapons to be used, but as a memorial. Mounted above the mantel of the farmhouse, alongside a small portrait of Thomas that Caroline had commissioned from a traveling photographer. "I thought you should have them back," Frank said, when Caroline stood before the mounted guns with tears in her eyes. "Not because you need them, but because I think it is right that Thomas's memory hangs in this house too, alongside ours. He gave you the courage to sell them when you needed to. I think it is only fitting he should be remembered for that courage, rather than simply for the guns themselves." Caroline turned to him and kissed him, long and slow, in the golden light of the farmhouse kitchen, where so much of their courtship had unfolded. "You are the kindest man I have ever known, Frank Barnett," she said. "I did not think, that spring morning I rode into town with those guns wrapped in an old blanket, that I would find anything more than enough money for seed corn. I never imagined I would find you." "I never imagined I would find you either," Frank said. "I had given up on love long before you walked into my shop. I had made my peace with a quiet life alone, fixing guns and keeping to myself, and telling myself that was enough. You taught me it did not have to be enough. You taught me that a person can love twice in one lifetime, fully and completely both times, without one love diminishing the other." They stood together in the kitchen a long while that evening, watching the light fade gold and then blue over the fields that had once nearly broken Caroline entirely, and had instead, through hardship and love and the particular stubborn grace of the Kansas soil, become the foundation of everything good in both their lives. By 1885, the Barnett farm had become one of the most respected homesteads in Sweetwater Flats, known throughout the county for the quality of its corn and the warmth of its hospitality, and Caroline Harper Barnett, who had once stood at the edge of a dusk-gray field with her dead husband's guns clutched in trembling hands, had become a woman the whole community looked to with respect, a woman who had proven, through her own quiet determination, that a widow left with nothing but 40 acres and a stubborn mule could build not just a farm, but an entire life, rich with love and laughter, and the particular deep satisfaction of a debt owed to no one. She never forgot Thomas and never pretended to. His memory lived in the guns above the mantel, in the son who bore his name, in the careful way she still tended the rose he had first broken with his own hands, but she had learned, through the long, slow unfolding of that first hard year of widowhood, that honoring the dead did not require abandoning the living, and that the heart, however broken, retained an extraordinary capacity to heal and to open itself again to love, provided one had the courage to let it. On quiet evenings, when the children were finally settled and the farm work done for the day, Caroline and Frank would sometimes sit together on the porch that Frank had rebuilt and strengthened in their second year of marriage, watching the sun go down over fields that had once seemed impossibly fragile and now stood as solid and enduring as the love that had grown between them. And Caroline would think back sometimes to that morning she had ridden into Sweetwater Flats with nothing but grief and desperation, and a bundle of guns wrapped in an old blanket, and marvel at the distance she had traveled since. She had sold her late husband's guns to buy seed, not knowing what waited for her beyond that single desperate act of survival, and she had never once looked back with regret, because looking back would have meant doubting the life that had grown from that decision. A life full of children's laughter and Frank's steady love and fields that turned gold every autumn with the harvest of a partnership built on courage and kindness in equal measure. The years continued to unfold gently after that, each season bringing its own particular rhythm of labor and reward, and the Barnett family grew to include a third child, a boy named Elias, whom they named not for the banker who had once tried to take their land, but for Frank's own father, a coincidence of names that Caroline found she rather enjoyed, given how thoroughly her own Elias had turned out to be the better man where it counted. Thomas Franklin grew into a boy who loved horses more than anything else in the world, spending every free hour he could steal down at the barn with the family's growing herd, while Susanna Rose showed an early talent for numbers that had Frank teaching her the workings of a ledger before she had even turned 10, joking that perhaps she would take over the running of accounts for the whole farm one day, a suggestion Susanna took with the utmost seriousness. Young Elias, the baby of the family, was quieter than his siblings, content to sit beside his mother while she worked, watching everything with a careful attention that reminded Frank, more than once, of the way Caroline herself had once watched the world in those difficult early months of her widowhood, absorbing every detail as though determined to master it. Elias Prout's railroad speculation eventually came to nothing, the survey company choosing a route further south after all, just as Caroline had told him it would, and the banker's fortunes, never quite as robust as his manner suggested, declined slowly over the following decade until he sold his interest in the Sweetwater Flats Bank and moved east, a departure that occasioned no particular mourning among the townsfolk he left behind. Caroline heard the news from Mrs. Odell one autumn afternoon and found she felt nothing more complicated than a mild, distant satisfaction, the kind of feeling one has upon closing a door on a room one no longer has any reason to enter. Mrs. Odell herself remained a fixture in Caroline's life for many years afterward, growing old alongside her, attending the births of all 3 Barnett children, and living long enough to see young Thomas Franklin married in 1901 to a schoolteacher from the next county over, a match that filled Caroline with a particular tender joy, watching her firstborn stand at an altar much as she herself had stood, twice now, in that same small church, and speak vows that carried forward the love she and Frank had built into yet another generation. Frank never did return to gunsmithing full-time, though he kept a small workbench in the barn where he continued to tinker and repair firearms for neighbors who asked, more out of enjoyment than necessity, and he took particular pleasure, as the years passed, in teaching his sons to shoot safely and responsibly, using the very same Colt revolvers that had once bought Caroline her first desperate season of seed corn. Revolvers that had traveled from Thomas Harper's hands to Frank's shop and back again to hang above a mantel, and now, occasionally, down from that mantel into the hands of a new generation who understood them not as tools of violence, but as heirlooms of survival and love both. Caroline herself, in her later years, took to keeping a small journal, recording the seasons of the farm and the small triumphs and sorrows of family life, and in its opening pages, written in the careful, deliberate hand of a woman who had once feared she might lose everything and instead found everything worth having, she had set down a single entry dated to that long-ago spring morning, which read simply, sold Thomas's guns today to Frank Barnett at the gun shop in town. Enough for seed corn and more besides. Frightened but hopeful, something told me riding home that better days were coming, though I could not have said why I felt it so strongly. I did not look back once on the road home, and I have never once regretted it since. She would sometimes read that entry aloud to her children and grandchildren in later years, on quiet winter evenings by the fire, the same fire that had warmed her and Frank through so many seasons of courtship and marriage both. And she would tell them the whole story, from the desperate ride into town, to the kindness of a gunsmith who had refused to take advantage of a grieving widow, through the drought and the threatened foreclosure and the slow, patient blooming of a love neither of them had expected to find twice in one lifetime. And she would always end the telling the same way, with Frank's hand finding hers across whatever table or porch step they happened to be sitting at, and the two of them exchanging a look that needed no words at all to communicate everything they had built together. "Your grandmother," Frank would say to whichever grandchild happened to be listening, "is the bravest woman I have ever known. She lost everything a person can lose, and instead of letting it break her, she sold what she had to sell, and planted what needed planting, and never once looked back. And that is how she ended up with all of you and with me, and with a farm that has fed this family for 3 generations now and will feed generations more, if we tend it right. And your grandfather," Caroline would add, every single time without fail, "is the kindest man I have ever known, and he loved me back to life when I had nearly forgotten how to live, and I thank God every single day that I walked into his shop that morning instead of anywhere else, because I do not know what would have become of me otherwise." They lived out the remainder of their long lives together on that same 40 acres, grown now to nearly 200 through the decades of careful stewardship and hard work, watching their children marry and have children of their own, watching the town of Sweetwater Flats grow from a scattering of frontier buildings into a proper small city with a railroad depot after all, though not the one Pruitt had once hoped to profit from, and a school and a proper brick church to replace the leaning wooden one where they had married, and through every change and every season, the love that had grown between a grieving widow and a kind gunsmith remained the steady, unshakable center of it all, a love born from an act of desperate courage on a gray spring morning, and tended, ever after, with the same patient care that had once coaxed corn from dry Kansas soil against every reasonable expectation of success. Caroline Harper Barnett died in the winter of 1931, at the age of 79, in the same farmhouse she and Frank had shared for over 50 years, with Frank himself, then 85 and still remarkably spry, holding her hand through her final hours, surrounded by children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren who had come to say their goodbyes. Frank followed her only 8 months later, in the autumn, passing peacefully in his sleep in the same bed, and the family buried them together beneath a single headstone in the Sweetwater Flats Cemetery, not far from where Thomas Harper himself had been laid to rest more than half a century before, 3 graves forming a quiet triangle of love and loss and second chances that the family visited every spring, bringing flowers and telling always the story of the guns and the seed, and the courage of a woman who had refused to let grief have the final word. The farmhouse still stands today, passed down through 5 generations of the Barnett family, and the 2 Colt revolvers and the Henry rifle still hang above the mantel where Frank first placed them, a quiet testament to a story that the family has never stopped telling, generation after generation, of how a widow's desperate courage and a gunsmith's quiet kindness had come together, on the hard Kansas plains of 1878, to build a love that lasted a lifetime and echoed on long after. In every field of corn that rose green and gold from that same stubborn, faithful soil.